Welcome to Guide to IELTS. In today's video, we are going to write a sample answer for this graph from Cambridge IELTS Book 18. So let's break down this task together step by step. By the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of how to approach and tackle writing task 1 effectively. First things first, what to do and what not to do in IELTS Writing Task 1 Academic. Do not write any part of your answer in points. Write complete sentences. Do not use contractions. Do not give opinions, so just write what you see in the given illustration. Write at least 150 words. There is no upper word limit. The question mentions select and report the main features and make comparisons. So the answer needs to have the most important and relevant details. Minor points and details can be left out. Write an overall statement. An overall statement gives a general overview of the whole graph without going into specific details. Let's get started. Don't start writing immediately. I follow 3 steps before I start the actual writing. First, look at the graph to understand it. I call this step trust your eyes. I do this before I even read the question. In the case of this graph, what do my eyes tell me? 4 lines, some ups and downs, and a few intersections also. Intersections mean where the lines cross each other. Means the value was the same for 2 things at that time. 2 lines start together, but they follow different paths, and the other 2 are also near. In total, everything is increasing. The line at the top stands out. For most of the time, it is above everything else. Now, I read the question, look at the graph, and decide what to write and in what order. This planning is important for 2 reasons. One of the criteria of assessment in IELTS writing is cohesion and coherence. This means sentences should fit together smoothly and the information in the writing should make sense. The information can make sense if it is written in a proper order. If I write something about one thing, then start writing about the second thing, and then write something about the first thing again, it may just confuse the reader. That writing will score low on this criterion of cohesion and coherence. Also, you need to identify the main features before you start writing, and you need to identify what comparisons you can make. In this graph, the x-axis has years, the y-axis has percentages, and the lines are for different countries. The years are from 1970 to 2040. So we have information about the past, the present, and the future. The vocabulary we use when the future is mentioned in a graph is very specific. I'll keep pointing it out as we write. Also, we'll be using all the 3 tenses as well. What happened in the past, what is happening now, and what is expected to happen in the future. Whenever there are years in a graph, we look for trends. Are things increasing, decreasing, or fluctuating over the years, or are they steady? In graphs and tables, I begin planning by looking for the highest and the lowest through the years. In a line graph, initially I just look at the beginning and the end of each line. In this case, I will look at the beginning, the present, that is 2024, and the future. So throughout this graph, the present is 2024. If you're watching this later, the writing will have to be changed accordingly. And then I look for any major notable changes in between. In the beginning, that is 1970, 2 lines are at the highest point. So let's start with those. The highest in 1970 are 2 countries, Philippines and Malaysia. After that, let's look at the path for Malaysia first. Between 1970 and the present, Malaysia increased more and increased consistently. And in the future, we see that it will continue to increase. Philippines, we see some ups and downs, but by 2024, even it has increased overall. And again in future, we are expecting an increase. Let's look at the other two lines now. The lowest is Indonesia, but Thailand is close to it. And since these are the only two left, we can write these two together. So in 1970, both are around 20. After that, we see that they intersect. That is, they will have the same percentage in this year. After this intersection, Indonesia increases a lot more till present, that is till 2024. And in future, also it will increase. Malaysia also increases overall till now and in the future. And we can also mention that the percentage stays almost stagnant between 2000 and now. So this basically gives me the information that I need for my body paragraphs and a tentative idea of in what order I would want to write it in my answer. Besides this, during the planning stage, I look for any notable features that are there in the graph which should be mentioned in the writing. One such feature that I can see is that even though all 4 countries see an increase overall, the increase is much higher in Malaysia. Another one could be this drop in percentage in case of Philippines. Because we can see that except for this part, everywhere in the graph, either there is an increase or there is no change. Now that I have a vague outline of what I will write and in what order, there is one more step before I start writing. I look at the words from the question that I think will be used repeatedly in the answer. Lexical resource is one of the assessment criteria for IELTS writing. So I need to make sure that I use a variety of words. Some such words from the question are percentage, population, countries, cities, and predictions. I keep them in mind as I write. I consciously try to use some variation or synonym of these words. A very important caution here though, not all synonyms of a word can replace it in all contexts. And it is better to repeat a word in your writing than use the wrong word. Let's start writing now. As we write, we have to make sure that we are using a variety of words and that we are using a variety of sentence types. I'll keep pointing these out as I write. While making a note of the words and phrases, divide them into 2 categories, general vocabulary and topic-specific vocabulary. General vocabulary would include words and phrases which can be used in almost every Writing Task 1 academic response. For example, respectively, former, latter, and significantly. But there are other words and phrases too, which you can use if you're writing about population of a country or about cities, or if percentages or years are part of your question. Be mindful of this difference. The format that I'll follow is paraphrasing of the question, overall statement, and body paragraphs. You can also write overall statement at the end. Let's paraphrase the question. Paraphrasing is when you say something in a different way, but keep the same meaning. This is the question that we have. There could be many different ways of paraphrasing this. Be on a lookout for a video that will be posted soon about paraphrasing of Writing Task 1 academic questions. One way to paraphrase is to change some words in the question. For example, graph can be changed to either chart or line graph or line chart. The word below from the question can either be deleted or it can be replaced with words like given or provided, and so on. Here is a paraphrasing of this question. The provided line chart illustrates the urban population percentages across 4 Asian nations from 1970 to 2020, alongside projections for 2030 and 2040. Here's a list of changes that I have made. Notice especially the change from percentage of population to population percentages. The words remain the same, but the way they are used is different, and that adds to your lexical resource. Here's another paraphrasing of the same question. The line graph provided offers insights into the demographic shifts in urban populations across 4 Asian nations, spanning the period from 1970 to the present, with projections extended to 2030 and 2040. The most noteworthy part in this one is demographic shifts. Demographic means information about populations. For example, how many males and females are there in the population, where people live, how many work in which profession, etc. Demographic shift means changes in the type of people in a place. For example, if more young people start living in a town, that's a demographic shift. These can be used in Writing Task 1 Academic whenever the question has anything to do with population of a country, and this word can also be useful in Writing Task 2. After the paraphrasing, we need to write the overall statement. Overall statement is like summarizing the most important thing you see in the graph. It should be short and simple, preferably one sentence. You should avoid writing any figures in the overall statement. In this graph, between 1970 and 2024, all lines have different trends, but overall, each of them has increased. And after that also, all of them will increase. So this is the overall statement. Overall, the proportion of those residing in cities has seen a gross augmentation since 1970, indicating significant urbanization trends. The same trend is forecasted to continue for the coming couple of decades as well. I have used 2 sentences here because this question contains predictions as well, and I don't want to make too long a sentence which may be confusing. Here's a list of the noteworthy vocabulary that I have used here. A phrase that I have used is gross augmentation. Augmentation means increase. Gross means overall or net. These words will be used quite a bit throughout the writing because we see that from 1970 to 2024, overall there is an increase. There's a gross increase. But between this time, there are some ups and downs. Overall or on the whole, there's an increase. Another word that I've used here is decade. Instead of saying 20 years, I've used a couple of decades. Now we start with the body paragraphs. This is the planning we have for what to write and in what order. First, we start with Malaysia and Philippines in 1970. I'm using the words Malaysians and Filipinos for the people of Malaysia and Philippines, respectively. During your test, make these changes only if you're absolutely sure about what people of a certain country are called. Otherwise, there are many other simpler ways to use a variety of words. So what we are writing is, in 1970, the approximate number of Filipinos and Malaysians who were city dwellers was 30%. So people who live in cities are city dwellers. Instead of using the word approximately, I've changed the sentence structure and used the word approximate. Now I'll focus first on Malaysia from 1970 to the present and then the present to 2040. Over the next 5 decades, this figure rose more or less steadily in Malaysia, gradually reaching the present figure of nearly 80%. By 2040, it is projected that this statistic will exceed 80%. Make a note of words such as figure and statistic. Instead of using synonyms of percentage, which do not work in this context, words like figure and statistic are better, and these can be used in any graph question of Writing Task 1 Academic. Also, if we look at the line of Malaysia here, we see that between 1970 and 1990, the increase is not as much as it is later, which is why I've used the phrase more or less steadily. One of the main features that I'd noticed when planning was that the increase in Malaysia is much higher as compared to all others. So this I'm going to mention here. This surge of almost 45% among urban Malaysians in half a century is a notable detail in the graph. Notice the use of the phrase half a century instead of 50 years and the usage of the word surge. Surge means a sudden increase or a notable increase in something. It is a synonym of increase but with a very specific meaning. Make sure you understand the exact meaning of words when you use them. Now we'll write about Philippines in the same way. What happens from 1970 to the present and what happens from the present to the future. In contrast, despite some fluctuations, the Philippines registered a much lower net hike with close to 40% living in cities currently, along with a further increase of around 10% being expected over the subsequent 16 years. Once again, I've used quite a few synonyms. The list is here. Also make a note of words and phrases like despite and in contrast, which help improve your writing. Now we'll start writing about Indonesia and Thailand. As for the Thai and Indonesian urbanites, they accounted for approximately 20% and 15% of the total populace in 1970, respectively. Experiencing a consistent rise, by 2020, this demographic in each country amounted to the same percentage at just under a third of the citizenry. Respectively is a word which I think can be used in almost every writing task 1 academic writing. In this case, I could have written that Thai urbanites accounted for 20% and Indonesian urbanites accounted for 15%. But I mentioned the name of the two countries first together and then mentioned the two figures, respectively, is used to indicate that the first figure is for the first country and the second figure is for the second country. Later in this writing, I'll be using another variation of this word, respective. Also note the phrase under a third, which means less than 33%. Words like quarter, half, third can be used whenever we have percentages in the question. Now we'll mention that Indonesia increases at a faster rate. And because it's an important detail or a noteworthy detail, I'm starting this sentence with significantly. Significantly, post the year 2000, the growth rate accelerated in Indonesia compared to Thailand, where the percentage was stagnant. The resulting outcome has the current urban inhabitants of the former at 50%, in contrast to 30% for the latter. The respective predictions for these numbers are 60 and 40% in 2040. Here I have used the words former and latter. If we are talking about two things and later we want to refer to them again without mentioning them, the former means the first thing that was mentioned and latter means the second thing. Now we only have one notable feature left that we have not mentioned, which is this drop that Philippines experienced. Here's how I'm writing it. While on the whole, there was an increasing trend in urban population across all four countries, the Philippines stands out as the only nation where a noticeable drop in percentage occurred between 1990 and 2010. Let's now quickly look at some of the vocabulary that helped us write this answer. First is synonyms for cities and people who live in cities. So urban regions, urban areas. Another is synonyms for words like people and population. In this case, because we are referring to people of a country, we can use words like residents and inhabitants. These words cannot be used as a replacement for people in every context. For example, in your writing task 2 question, when it says some people believe, we can't change it to some residents believe. But here, because we are talking about people of a country, we can do that. Whenever years are mentioned in your graph, keep words like decade and century in mind. They can be used if you're talking about 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. Then we have the word percentage. We can change percentage to proportion or maybe ratio, but we can also avoid repeating the word by using words like figure and statistic or using the phrase statistical measure. Look at the different sentence structures here. There are certainly some synonyms of increase being used, such as hike and increment. But it is also important to keep in mind that different forms of the same word also add to your vocabulary score. For example, the word increase and increased. And you can use the same word but make different kind of sentences with it. Here are some phrases that you can use when referring to percentage of something. In this writing, we have only used a third, which is 33%. And because we don't have exact figures in this writing, we do need a lot of variations of the word approximately. So here's a list of a few. Whenever future is mentioned in a graph question or a table question, that future is a prediction. Here are a few different sentence structures and synonyms that you can use when writing about this. It is important to understand that there is no one correct way to respond to a writing question. In some other videos, I've written more than one answer to the same question to highlight this. That's it for now. Hope this helped you. All the very best.